All right, you guys, let's take a look at the hyperorbit and where we put it into the mix of things. So this is a finishing machine. It's not the hyper grinder. It's not a planetary sander by any stretch. It's one disc on the bottom, and it spins around, and it also kind of does it in a random motion, which I'll show in a minute. So here is the motion of that plate, and it also spins at the same time while it's going on the floor. And we opted for the vacuum, the onboard vacuum. The onboard vacuum comes off the unit really simple. If you wanted to just run a dust collector, you would just take this hose off and run the dust collection hose onto that. And then you just press this button here, and this hose comes out. And then the vacuum, there's a knob here. We can unloosen this, lift this bracket up, and the vacuum comes right off if you didn't want to run the vacuum. The nice thing is this is plugged into a 15 amp circuit breaker, 15 amp plug. The vacuum on the front, and I'll start the machine up. We've yet to blow a breaker with the vacuum and the machine running through a 15 amp circuit. There are a variety of ways to run this machine. You can run it just like this with the wheels down. You can also run it like this with the wheels up. This is much like a Trio in the sense that it doesn't have a cut spot, unlike a buffer, which is usually about the 4 o'clock position, or the hyper grinder, which is generally about the 4 o'clock position. This machine has no cut point. The base of the machine actually does tilt, much like the Trio, or you can lock it. So the base of the machine is free floating inside the handles, much like a Trio. The current abrasive on there is a double-sided silicone carbide 80 grit paper. We ran the hyper grinder in here up to 80 grit bone of black, and we're going to start this machine and end this machine with 80 grit bone of black, and that's going to finalize the sanding for this job. Where normally on clear coats, which is what this is going to be, we would run the hyper grinder up to 100 grit. If we're going to do a stain job, we'd run the stain job up to 120. 80 grit bone of black silicone carbide paper is a softer mineral. And like we tell people, it's not just a mineral that counts, it's how the mineral's being moved. So because this machine moves the mineral in such a unique fashion, from what we're seeing, an 80 grit will give the floor somewhere around between 150 and a 180 grit cut in feel to it. It feels like velvet, looks like velvet. Some other people have described it, it feels and looks like paper. Most of us with our planetaries are creating tabletop-like finishes. This is just the next step up where this machine will create a piano top finish. You can apply stain with this machine, and you can also do intercoat abrasion. So we are currently in a raised ranch, and I'm up on the raised part of it where the 3 bedrooms are, and these 3 bedrooms have been done. Final sanding was with the hyperorbit with 80 grit bone of black silicone carbide paper. And like I said, this floor looks and feels like velvet. The vacuum system on that thing is pretty good. Its floor still has to be vacuumed. Still feel some grip from the abrasive that came off. But the vacuum system on that thing really is decent. The machine does get right against the wall also. Gets right against the base. Does a really nice job. And that's an 80 grit cut. It really is an amazing machine. It just brings the sanding to the next level. But again, keep in mind, it cannot and does not do what the hyper grinder does. Hyper grinder is going to keep your floor nice and flat, and then this is just going to redirect the scratch pattern into a non-existent scratch pattern. This is just absolutely stunning, especially for an 80 grit. Let's go see it in action. If she does like to walk it like the Trio, I'm going to do the dining room part of the house with the handles up and over it. Show a little bit more weight placed on the base of it. And show you how I like to run it. Alright, you saw how Chrissy likes to run it, much like the Trio. And there is no resistance running this machine. There's actually less resistance running this machine than there is running the Trio. But again, the Trio is a planetary, and this is not. Trio is designed like any other planetary to cut the floor flat. This is just now totally redefined the scratch pattern. So when I run it, I am going to cut the border first of the run, and I like to run it with about the 10 or 11 o'clock position against the wall, and I am going to tilt up the handle a little bit and run it with the wheels off the ground and just kind of float the base of the machine along the perimeter before I make my field cut. So let me show you the perimeter cut and how I do it. You probably heard a little bit of rattling going on while the hyper orbit ran over part of the floor. And the reason being is because whoever did this install didn't nail down every row. So the floor is actually in fact loose in some places. Rows of it are loose. Now let's take a look and I'll show you how I like to run it with the handle up and over itself to give it a little more weight projected downward on the unit. So I like to run it this way. overall for us, the decision to purchase that machine was just a really good decision. It just brings the sanding up to a whole different level. And as I said before, less fatigue on the body. We're actually taking out at least one sanding process on stain jobs, which means one vacuuming process also removed. And it just brings the whole floor to a different level. And these are the sanding discs that we normally use. Double-sided, 80 grit. Silicone carbide paper does not last as long as your ceramics. So you are going to have to flip these over if that's what you use. And we use the softer mineral for the final cuts. It just works. We are going to play in the future with some other abrasives on it. Obviously, they're going to be ceramics and go from there. We did do a little bit of playing with it with a 80 grit red heat screen, which obviously you'll get a little more mileage out of that ceramic than you will out of the silicone carbide, and that actually worked out fantastic as well. We have not applied stain with the machine yet, as I said, and we have not done intercoat abrasion with that machine yet. Intercoat abrasion, we'll end up doing 2 coats on this job tomorrow, and we'll come back the following day and we'll abrade that with the hyper orbit, with the maroon pad, with the PSA 180 paper on it, and see how that does at intercoat abrasion. Normally on stain jobs, we're going to sand the floor up to 120 grit if we didn't have the hyper orbit. So we would come in with our big machine, do the rough cuts, same with the edger, then we would bring in the hyper grinder and run the hyper grinder, starting it at 80 grit, and then 100 grit, and then 120 grit, and water pop the floor, apply the stain, and then we're off to the races. Now that we have the hyper orbit, we can still run the same process. The difference would be is that we're actually stopping the hyper grinder at 80 grit, and then we're bringing in the hyper orbit, and that also is going to run just an 80 grit. And from there we would water pop the floor and then stain it. So we're removing one sanding process in a case like that, and also one vacuuming process. So if you think about that in a 1,000 square foot job, which is what this one is, granted this is going to be a clear coat, but if you can remove one sanding process and one vacuuming process, job after job, if you're doing a lot of stain jobs, at the end of the year, that's a lot of sanding processes and vacuuming processes removed. And the quality of the job is just much greater. The hyper orbit can also be moved with a little bit quicker. You don't need to walk it quite as slow as you do with the planetary sanders. The first job that we did it on was a stain job. It was a maple floor that we sanded and refinished, and the client wanted it stained with bergacidal walnut stain. And we had applied the stain with the buffer. We haven't tried to apply stain here with the hyper orbit, although you can. On that job, we decided to go with what we know and use the buffer. And what we discovered was we're closing up the grain tighter with the hyper orbit, but you're not burnishing it. You're not polishing it. So the flooring itself still has some hook to it, some tooth to it for the chemicals to bite onto. What we discovered was that the stain went quite a lot further, and same with the polyurethane. The polyurethane afterwards also went further than normal. So our experience so far is that for us, it's more efficient and effective and a better job to run the hyper orbit. We're saving time, we're saving processes, we're getting a better overall sand job out of it, and we're also saving money in abrasives and urethane and stain.